Picture this, a sales conference where the keynote speaker is none other than the then sitting president of the United States. It happened in July of 1916. And it wasn't because the president had nothing to do that day, happened to be in town and decided to swing by. There was a world war raging in Europe, what we now know as World War I. It was because Woodrow Wilson had an important message for the sales world that day. It was the United States' opportunity to establish itself as a world superpower, and it depended largely on salespeople to make it happen. He had 4 lessons he wanted every salesperson to hear clearly and embrace. It was the most significant sales keynote speech of all time. These are those lessons. Episode 56 of the Sales History Podcast.
There is nothing new in the world of sales except for the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, bringing the brilliant and sometimes strange minds, methods, and ideas from the sales profession's past with applications to today. Here is your host, the best-selling author of 2 books, with a 3rd coming in January of 2026. CSP speaker, trainer, and nerd, Todd Caponi.
Could there have been a more important sales keynote? It was July of 1916. Europe was in chaos, with much of it having just crossed over the 2-year mark of what we now know as World War I. At this point, millions of young lives had been lost, and while the United States hadn't gotten involved, would certainly keep an eye on it. It was also July of 1916 that something significant was happening in the world of sales. It was when the first World Sales Congress was taking place in Detroit, Michigan. Attended by over 3,000 people, it was really the first of its kind in terms of sales conferences. But to me, what's even more incredible about it is the keynote speaker was then sitting President Woodrow Wilson. Now, again, imagine there's a sales conference going on, and the then sitting president comes and keynotes it. Well, that's what happened. Now, I have dedicated one of the first episodes of the Sales History Podcast to the event itself. But this time, I was reading the keynote speech and decided to really dig into it. Now, history tells us Wilson would certainly not make the top 10 lists of U.S. presidents. His speech I found to be profound in its lessons for the sales profession. Now, again, at the time, America was industrializing at an incredible pace. It was called the Progressive Era because of how manufacturing was booming. At this point, railroads and telegraphs had connected the entire country, and business leaders were really starting to think globally. There were 4 what I call timeless lessons from Woodrow Wilson's sales keynote, and I want to take you through them from least important to most important. So I want to start with the first one, which was this idea of ending our small-minded selling mindset. And what I mean by that was this. Wilson believed and shared in his speech that America had been timid up until this point. He said, quote, "America, of all countries in the world, has been timid. She has raised up an extraordinary number of provincial thinkers." So what he's saying there is he felt as though America had a huge opportunity to become a superpower right then. The rest of the world was fighting, and we were over here building. But he felt organizations kept thinking provincially. In other words, locally. His message at the time was essentially that the time for small-minded selling was over, that the United States needed to play, quote, "a part of unprecedented opportunity and greatly increased responsibility." And what he was saying was that's not to happen by politicians, it was to happen by salespeople. So that was number 1, ending this small-minded selling mindset. Number 2 was embracing customer centricity. He said, quote, "Hereafter, salesmanship will have to be closely related to statesmanship, to international statesmanship." His message here was that the role of salespeople wasn't just to sell things. It was basically to understand things, to become intelligent about the markets, to better discovery, to build empathy. He talked not about pushing harder or hustling more, but instead he said success would depend on, quote, running your intelligence ahead of your goods. He said, quote, if you're going to sell carpets in India, you've got to have as good taste as the Indians in the patterns of the carpets. So early views on selling and serving buyers adapted to their worldviews. Pretty profound to think about customer centricity in 1916. The number 3 lesson was essentially the salesperson's job is service. And I've been preaching this for a long time here, but think about it. Your sales kickoffs and almost every sales conference has a theme, right? Well, the theme of the World Sales Congress in 1916 there in Detroit, Michigan was one word: service. The whole concept was about talking about imparting service mindset into the sales organizations. Now, legislation like the Clayton Act of 1914 was designed to limit the power of massive organizations that had, up to that date, taken advantage of the weakness of the Sherman Act, which was the Anti-Monopoly Act of 1890. In other words, selling was no longer about dominating, it was about service. Wilson said, quote, there is a great deal of cant talked about service, but it is the key to everything that concerns the peace and prosperity of the world. He then added, quote, you cannot force yourself upon anybody who is not obliged to take you. In other words, a lesson we all know today that has been shared for over 100 years, even by a sitting president, is force creates resistance, and true influence comes from serving. Again, serving, doing the homework for the buyer, focusing on the buyer achieving optimal outcomes as quickly as possible, whether it's through your solution or another. I mean, I know shameless self-plug here, but that's the core message of my first book, The Transparency Sale. I guess it might have been interesting to have a president support that first book, right? But Wilson then went on and used Mexico as an example of how to think about selling. Now, apparently at the time, tensions were pretty high between the U.S. and Mexico. And there were quite a few that thought America should just use force to, quote, help Mexico and essentially impose our control over them. Wilson was vehemently not interested in that idea, which this concept might sound like it has nothing to do with sales, but then he did. And I actually love this analogy. Wilson said, quote, that is the long way to help Mexico, as well as the wrong way. After the fighting, you will have a nation full of justified suspicion and hostility. In other words, the lesson there is you can't build trust if your approach is to overpower people. You build trust by serving them. Wilson then added, quote, what makes Mexico suspicious of us is that she does not believe we want to serve her. She believes we want to possess her. What's the perspective that the recipients of a high-pressure salesperson have even today? I'd argue it's simply to replace that word Mexico in that first sentence with your customers. So I'll say it again, with that replacement. What makes your customer suspicious of us is that she does not believe we want to serve her. She believes we want to possess her. In other words, when your approach comes across as that of self-interest, it has a scent. Your buyers can smell you wanting to possess the deal, the client, and your commission. As a result, the customer recoils. And again, as I've been screaming from the mountaintops for the past however many years, we do not buy when we're convinced. We buy when we can predict. Our role is to help the buyer predict, and to do that genuinely and transparently and through the lens of service. I don't know. I guess it's amazing to me that Wilson understood that and made it a part of his keynote. And it's also amazing that he used international relations to make the point. So well done there. Point number 3, lesson number 3 was the salesperson's job is service. In what is probably my favorite lesson of his keynote, it's lesson number 4 from this episode, it's simply to be a good human. It was near the end when Wilson told a story about the English writer Charles Lamb. And he said this, quote, he stuttered a little bit, and he said of someone who was not present, I hate that man. And someone said, why, Charles, I didn't know you knew him. Oh, he said, I don't. I can't hate a man I know. That is a profound human remark. You cannot hate a man you know. That's the end of that quote, but the lesson was hate and misunderstanding. Those two items thrive when there's distance between them. And that was Wilson's point. And while it might not sound like it has much to do with sales, I'm going to remember this one. You cannot hate a man you know. Wilson was making a point about nations and about people. When you actually get to know someone and take the time to understand their point of view, it becomes impossible to hate them. Wilson said, quote, as long as you do not understand a country, you cannot trade with it. I think it's an incredible lesson either way. Have conversations with people, connect with them, and practice empathy. In the world of selling, how can we build trust without empathy? It makes it a lot harder to trade with another country, but I'd argue it makes it very difficult to sell to another human being too. So that was lesson number 4, be a good human being. Now, Wilson ended this keynote with this quote, and I think it's pretty fantastic. He says, quote, lift your eyes to the horizons of business. Do not look too close at the little processes with which you are concerned, but let your thoughts and imaginations run abroad throughout the whole world and sell goods that will make the world more comfortable and more happy. That was from 1916. Should it not be from 2025 and beyond too? What about this paragraph can someone possibly disagree with? The message was essentially to lift our eyes beyond the product or service we are selling, beyond our quarterly target, and beyond the commissions and bonuses we'll receive by selling it. Stop forcing. Instead, take the time to understand your customers' perspectives and help them achieve it. That's service. Okay, so those were the 4 lessons from Woodrow Wilson's address to the World Salesmanship Congress in Detroit, Michigan. That took place on July 10th of 1916. There was 4 things there. End small-minded selling. Embrace customer centricity. The salesperson's job is service. And just be a good human. What do you think? I look at it and think, how could there have possibly been any more important sales keynote in the history of the modern sales profession? What do you think? Please let me know. Reach out. You can find on my website ways to connect with me. As always, please share if you like this. Let me know what you thought. Rate it if you have an opportunity to. I do post at Sales Historian on both Instagram and X every weekday. So follow along if you like this kind of stuff. Quotes, pictures, comics, all kinds of things from history's past that in so many ways we can apply to today. But as always, I so appreciate you listening. Thanks.